Dave, welcome to the Science and Show podcast. Thanks for taking some time to chat with me today.
Thanks for having me, Brady.
No problem. So before we begin, can you briefly tell listeners where you're currently situated, currently residing, and then just give a brief introduction into your background? What's your educational history and what types of things are you working on now?
My background is I've been a software engineer my whole life. In fact, I point this out frequently that I'm not formally trained in science, much less biochemistry, medicine, anything along those lines. My engineering background is what informed me before, my story began, as you and I were talking about offline, which you can probably find in the other podcasts. But that was before I started doing experimenting and working into some other aspects of it. I'm currently in Las Vegas, Nevada, which is kind of ironic because a lot of the action comes in major cities outside of here, but at least LA is close, and that's where one of our major studies that we're doing right now is. And so I make frequent trips there. So at least it's nearby, but I'll concede sometimes in Las Vegas, there's not a lot of, say, research facilities where a lot of the I may be your first guest from Las Vegas. I wouldn't be surprised if that's the case.
Yeah, I think so, actually. So I get to mark that one off the list of, guests from around the world and around the United States. But yeah, you're right in that, a lot of the majority of it, if it's not in California, a lot of kind of the hub for research and for all this kind of stuff tends to be on like the East Coast. So I don't know, maybe you feel like you're a bit of an outcast out there, but luckily with the internet we can do, we're all connected these days, so that's a good thing.
That's true.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, of course, I work with a lot of my co-authors from recently were from Harvard, and so naturally we had a lot of time differences on when we were scheduling meetings and so on and so forth. So that came up quite a bit.
Yeah, that can definitely make it difficult, especially whether you're just trying to meet with like the 2 or 3 hour time difference, or like collaborating on manuscripts and things like that. You'll have somebody editing a manuscript and it's like, midnight their time or midnight your time, and it's like they want feedback. So those things can kind of get convoluted. I've done a few podcasts with people from like Australia and things. So doing that is always tricky to figure out those time differences. It's like, well, one of us is either going to have to stay up really late or wake up really early, but I tend to be early. So if they're willing to like do a podcast at 10 p.m., I'm fine with that. But my mind does not work that late at night. So never a good thing. And so you mentioned, this computer science background, and it's very interesting then in that you are kind of now delving into this world of metabolism and cholesterol and biochemistry and things like that. So I'm curious just to hear how you got interested in low carb diet and nutrition. Sort of what was your path to getting into this area? And then also, on top of that, once you started getting more deep into this area, like how did you self-educate yourself? Because a lot of these topics that you're interested in, especially cholesterol, I mean, even the people who are formally educated in cholesterol sometimes seem to not have a total grasp on like what's going on. So, first maybe tell people how you got into this sort of low carb cholesterol area, and, what type of self-education did you do to become so knowledgeable on all of these topics?
Sure. And I'll give you kind of a little bit more of the condensed elevator pitch, because there are many, other mediums where I've kind of talked this out at length, but I found the low carb diet while trying to avoid getting type 2 diabetes because my A1C was continually increasing. And in doing so, I saw that my cholesterol levels had gone up substantially, something that I had hoped wouldn't happen, even though I'd hear it here and there on the internet. And at that time, I became kind of obsessed with learning about this field, lipidology, the study of lipids. And there was a prominent name, Peter Attia, who had this great series called The Straight Dope on Cholesterol, which I think is still, by the way, findable, and it's really great. It was quite literally my very beginning of my education in understanding lipids. And he's tightly connected with somebody, Thomas Dayspring, who has more advanced, or at least at that time, he had more advanced material on a site called LecturePad. And so while it took me a while to work my way up from where Peter Attia's intentionally kind of basics version was to where Thomas Dayspring was. I was just fascinated because while at the same time I was kind of functioning from a place of fear, I was really concerned just how high my cholesterol went. I at the same time was feeling so many benefits from being on a ketogenic diet that I really wanted to understand better what was going on, at least to better quantify the risk. Like maybe my risk is a little bit higher, but definitely my risk was lower in terms of, for example, had more central adiposity. My waist to hip ratio had gone down a lot. My A1C, of course, had improved. And now that insulin was on my radar, I was keeping more of an eye on fasting insulin. Well, really, I kind of have the benefit of the age of not just being somebody who's already versed in software engineering, but also in information technology. It's really not too hard to get some very advanced understandings of many of some of these high level knowledge areas because so much of it's available online for free right now. And granted, lipidology is pretty up there. But that said, there was something that as a software engineer, I appreciated that I was seeing fairly early on and that I would contend to this day, which is it actually has a lot of correlations with modern network design. The system that moves around cholesterol inside your body is absolutely a network, and it has many things in common with the things I've been writing all my life. It has headers, it has packets, it has variability, it has load balancing. It's really quite amazing. So in a roundabout way, I kind of had a lot of an analogy of sorts that I've like not only, been aware of, but that I've actually helped build that I could connect with a lot of what we see with the lipid system.
Yeah, and that's fascinating. And it's also a common theme sort of among some individuals like you who are not traditionally trained in, say, biochemistry, that they tend to come from either a computer engineering or software or like a engineering background. And I think goes back to just what you said, like there's some very interesting kind of like overlap between not only cholesterol, but just in like, you think about the human body in terms of like physics and engineering. I mean, when you take it at the basic level, we're just like a system of tubes and pipes and things like that, and so when you apply those, physical, literally physics kind of concepts to the human body, it's like, wow, there are a lot of, you can make a lot of analogies. And so it makes sense that you were able to, I think, pick up those concepts easily, having that engineering background. Do you think that sort of just helped because it's like translatable over to like this area? Maybe that helped you expedite kind of the process of learning all of this?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, I often even call it the human operating system. And as with all operating systems, and this is kind of crucial to sort of understand, because a lot of times I think people think of it as how would you build the right human from scratch? Well, it's kind of like saying, how would you build the right network or platform from scratch? Like the iPhones we have, they weren't really, that the version that we have right now is really a multitude of versions, many more than we've ever even seen, because many of them, had iterations outside of our awareness, right? Mm-hmm. And what I'm basically saying is that at large scales, we're having constant trial and error. What does that sound like? That sounds, 101 Darwin, and that you've got built in a process by which you have, to some degree, intentional mutations that allow for all these permeations for which you can have this sort of survival of the fittest factor that's going on over and over again. So in a roundabout way, though, you need to be aware that this is constantly against environments and stimuli that's conducive to that thing that's constantly evolving. And that's the human operating system in that regard, in that it's, it's a fork, if you will, to speak computer here, of the animal kernel. And in many respects, we're now seeing where it's taken us. And yeah, obviously there's a lot of things that are really great about it. We're still kind of discovering how radical changes in our environment, especially our food environment, impact our health, even though the amazing irony is it's what we've helped to engineer ourselves. It's what we helped to create. And we're trying to even right now figure out how to roll back what and yet what and what to keep, et cetera.
No, yeah, certainly we're we've engineered ourselves into a kind of dangerous situation with regards to metabolic health. But I do find it, just going back to kind of your journey into low carb, I find it interesting, and kind of going along with this concept of like the human operating system, that, you went on this low carb and obviously like, improved your health and reduced your risk for diseases on kind of multiple points, reducing your A1C, your blood glucose, body fat percent, I would assume, and kind of increasing your muscle mass, and then seeing this increase in LDL. And so it's a very interesting, like, in that this one marker, your LDL moved, but all these other risk factors kind of improved. A lot of people would, thinking of cholesterol in kind of the traditional way would say, oh, well, that's dangerous. You shouldn't be doing that low carb diet. But then you point to all of these other outcomes. It's like, well, look, I'm objectively healthier on all these other endpoints. If you calculate your, 10-year cardiovascular disease risk or whatnot, you were objectively better besides maybe this LDL kind of particle. And so, or this LDL number. And so we can get into maybe in a little bit why you're the thinking of LDL, you're thinking about LDL and your different models. But I want to transition maybe not quickly, but to talk about your work on social media and just as like a citizen scientist. So, you have obviously been very, very outspoken on some of your ideas and have been able to share them on social media, which is incredible. That now that we have these tools, because, a while ago, if somebody had an idea that they wanted to share, it wasn't as easy. And so, a lot of what you're talking about, though, is somewhat controversial, especially among kind of classically trained physiologists, biochemists, doctors, etc. So you're unique, again, being somebody who's an outsider, outsider in quotes, being, you're a computer engineer who's now trying to, make himself into a biochemist, which, you are, and kind of established in that. So what are some of like the challenges that you have run into in sharing these ideas on social media and trying to have these ideas gain traction? I'm sure that there's been some pushback, but there's obviously been some acceptance. So kind of what has been your journey, maybe when you started sharing these ideas, and then, how has that evolved in sort of this effort to promote your ideas on social media?
Yeah, well, and that's a good question, because this kind of gets to the heart of the issue. I think you said cholesterol is somewhat of a controversial, or for that matter, having high cholesterol is somewhat of a controversial subject. I would argue.
Yeah, I guess cholesterol in and of itself is not cholesterol, but the high cholesterol and whether it's kind of causal of heart disease, right?
Right, and in that sense, I mean, I think that there's no question that many of the people who are critical of discussing the possibility of high cholesterol not being likewise a high consideration for risk are, in my opinion, very well intentioned, even if they feel a lot of people are taking the things that I'm saying and the things I'm proposing to be a hypothesis. I put more effort into stating that now than I ever did before. But that's why your question is a good one, in that when you're first talking about it and you have a follower count of 100, then you're wanting to get the discussion going. If you've got some concepts in how, for example, the causal directionality as it relates to your lipid profile could be very relevant. And let me kind of give you a quick example. I think that HDL cholesterol and triglycerides are extremely important to look at alongside LDL cholesterol. So looking at the profile, all three of them together. And as I'm sure you may have seen, our recent work, the papers that got released this year, they are around the so-called lean mass hyperresponder phenotype, which I developed in 2017, but it requires the combination of those three, and then it seeks to sort of advance the conversation and examination of risk around this phenotype. Well, getting to the point of even discussing this phenotype is a challenge, because how can I say, hey, I think that there may be something different going on, in that this is something that emerges. It's a change from one state to another state. But we don't really have hardly any data on these changes that are induced by diet in what is otherwise seemingly a metabolically healthy population. Rather, almost all of the studies that we have are usually on people who have some kind of metabolic dysfunction in lipid metabolism, either one that they're born with, such as familial hypercholesterolemia, or one that they acquire that also changes their profile, such as atherogenic dyslipidemia, which you see, for example, in people with metabolic syndrome. Sorry, atherogenic dyslipidemia is the low HDL and the high triglycerides, right? So here comes somebody who's outside, absolutely outside the field, who says, you know, I think that it may actually be relevant for us to look at those people who would have high HDL, low triglycerides alongside high LDL, because it seems as if this is more of a recent phenomenon to the degree where LDL goes this high in those people adopting a ketogenic diet. Let's study them. But how can I get people to study them? Well, part of it is even just in discussing that they may not be as high risk and explaining mechanistically why can bring around a lot more conversation of people going, oh, you know what? I think you're right. I think I'm going to be okay with my high LDL. Even if I'm stating explicitly that's not my intent. I'm not trying to instruct people. I'm trying to advance this model and this understanding. And that's the delicate balance. The delicate balance is how do you, and I'm dealing with this every day, how do you talk about ideas that could be relevant in their consideration of risk, but at the same time acknowledge where conventional medicine stands? I used to feel like, hey, the second one's a given. But as my profile has grown, I feel more of a need to express the second part anyway, even though in no way do I try to present myself as authority, and even though I emphasize this is a hypothesis.
And I'm sure it's difficult because you know, not that you, again, are, you know, giving advice, but I think that a lot in the traditional establishment, those of authority in this area, and again, I use authority in quotes, but like, they probably see this as sort of an attack. Like, who's this guy to come in and tell us, you know, that all of our medical history and whatever we know and what we've been recommending is totally wrong. And, you know, in a way, I mean, you are challenging some paradigms, but as you mentioned before, it's not necessarily challenging paradigms because you're presenting your models in this new paradigm of this person who is adopting a low carb diet, people who traditionally haven't been studied in, you know, regular medicine. Mostly medicine is, and even clinical trials and things like that are studies on metabolically unhealthy people, of which most people are. I mean, that recent data just come out, it's like 6% or something of Americans are metabolically healthy. And so, you know, 12% like 3 or 4 years ago. So, I mean, a lot of who we've been studying and basing our general medical knowledge on are not people who fit this criteria of the lean mass hyperresponder or the ketogenic sort of person, or even, you know, for that matter, somebody on like a carnivore diet. This is all fairly new. And so someone like you coming in and, you know, it's almost necessary to advance these ideas, because if things were just to go status, you know, remain the status quo, I think that, you know, people trained traditionally are going to keep up the status quo, whereas you, new ideas, new perspectives coming in, I think it's, you know, a great way to advance the science. But I guess, you know, have you received some pushback in terms of people claiming that you are making recommendations that could possibly be dangerous? You know, I'm sure that there have been people saying, oh, you know, you're an LDL denialist, saying that LDL doesn't cause heart disease. You're going to cause people to increase, you know, their risk of cardiovascular events by telling them that it's okay that their LDL is high. What has kind of been the experience with that, if you've experienced anything like that, which I'm sure you have?
Yes, all the time. There's a constant, I get a constant barrage of people. And again, I always want to, I don't know how much you follow me online. I try my best to always have as cordial a discussion as I can. And I believe it's very important to genuinely understand where other people are coming from. So there's, you know, I'm not going to call anybody out, but there's, for example, a cardiologist who I've had many dialogues with. And while I think from his perspective, he feels that, you know, just my ideas alone being expressed are highly dangerous, because people can get excited about the ideas and therefore turn away therapy he feels has a much stronger basis behind it. I get it. If somebody's a doctor and they're coming in and their patients are coming in, they're going, oh, well, I've read so-and-so who read so-and-so who cites Dave Feldman. And he says, that's exactly why, LDL isn't bad. Mm-hmm. What thresholds can anybody, including myself, I probably said I'm not a doctor over 100 times, right? In the course of the last several years, even though I feel like it shouldn't even be necessary to say, or this isn't medical advice, at least probably 1,000 times by this point across all these different media channels. But that said, a lot of people have the perspective in exactly what you described, that there should just be no further discussion on it. There shouldn't be any further efforts to lead the research to the people who do this for a living. And for what it's worth, this is the part of the story that I rarely get to share, but it's worth putting forward, which is that my journey started, my first results started in November of 2015. I was reaching out to lipidologists. I was reaching out to the Peter Attias and the Thomas Daysprings and anybody I could find in the National Lipid Association, because I, at that time, thought that it would get picked up and appreciated right away. In fact, where this gets even more interesting is, I want to say 2017, my talk at Breckenridge, which kind of brought this research to the next level. At that same time, there was a National Lipid Association conference that I was considering going and physically showing up to and like bringing the research and like wanting to talk to them there. And that was a key moment for me, because in this fork in the road, I was like, I think I'm going to go to Breckenridge instead, present the data as I see it right now, and hopefully that'll help move the needle. But I'm telling you right now, it's July 29th of 2022. And there are definitely still some luminaries who I would love to be excited about this research, who I'm hoping will get more going. But like the LMHR study that we have going on right now out of California, that I was just, that I haven't talked about yet, but where we actually are looking at CT angiograms of lean mass hyperresponders and borderline lean mass hyperresponders. It's the only one I know of its kind that's happening, even though I wrote that article in 2017. I know there's a lot of lipidologists who have LMHR patients. I would have thought, the me of 2015 would have thought by now there would be 50 studies that are going on around this phenotype. But that may be another factor. It may be that somebody on the outside looking at this from a different perspective might need to be a bit of a driving force to help push this forward.
No doubt. Yeah, and science is a slow moving machine, unfortunately. So sometimes, ideas that pop up take 9, 10 plus years to even get a couple papers published on them. So I'm sure in the ensuing decades, again, work led by you and others will provide us more data on this. When going back to 2017, when you say you were presenting data, whether it was online or at like the low carb conference in Breckenridge, when you say data, was this just data that you had gathered on yourself? So say like your lipid panels in response to diet, or did you have sort of data from multiple individuals, or was this kind of just a case study that you were using as this initial, let's say, pilot kind of data to present to people?
Well, yeah, mostly it was data on myself, because I was demonstrating principles of what would eventually be the lipid energy model. The most probably exciting thing to show was that in 3 days of binging on huge amounts of saturated fat, I could make my LDL cholesterol plummet. And that was anti-intuitive, because of course, even to this day, it's assumed that the higher levels of LDL we see in the populations who are low carb, including lean mass hyperresponders, is predominantly due to consumption of saturated fat. And if you just replace saturated fat, you'll have a low LDL, right? Which we can get into in a sec. But the key thing is, why would in an acute consumption, a very high consumption of a ketogenic ratio diet, result in a substantial dropping of LDL? And at that time, I didn't realize it, but it also made the other markers look quote unquote better. HDL cholesterol also went up by a lot, and triglycerides went down by a lot. So it seemed like everything just got better if I just suddenly binged on a whole lot of keto ratio food, including high amounts of saturated fat. So what I showed at that conference, probably, the featured graph, was my showing this inverse pattern, where when I consumed less, food, particularly ketogenic ratio, my cholesterol did the opposite. It would go up. My total LDL would go up. And when I stepped on the gas and consumed a huge amount of food, then it would go down. And I did this over 29 data points. And by 29 data points, what I really mean is 29 blood draws at LabCorp, where I'm literally going and getting it. And I flipped the graph, and that was kind of the big showman moment, where you can see just how tight that correlation is inversely. And it becomes more obvious when you flip one of the axes. Now, that said, there were other people by that point in time who had heard about my work and had done versions of that same protocol, reported back their data, and I reported some of their data in that same speech. And it was good because I think it at least got the conversation going within the low carb community. And that ended up being a big stepping stone to the research.
Yeah, certainly. And then, just going back to kind of the talking about, not, maybe receiving this pushback. I think, again, this just kind of goes back to not that the data that you showed were obviously, a lot and very well controlled, and you were showing some very interesting things. But I think when people see these N=1, they don't put a lot of stock in it. It's like, yeah, it's great. That's interesting. But is this going to disprove, our past 100 years of what we learned? A lot of people will not take kindly to that. So I think that's sort of where maybe a lot of the resistance comes from. It's like, whether it's you see this just a lot on social media in terms of diets. People will say, oh, this worked for me, and therefore this is wrong. And it's like, well, yeah, it worked for you, but that's why we have randomized controlled trials and things like that to really show what works. But like, you said, this was early on in its infancy, and now we will soon have kind of these maybe not randomized controlled trials, but prospective trials to actually get data on this. You mentioned just briefly, offline, that you were writing a book sort of about this concept. Do you want to maybe describe briefly maybe some of the ideas that kind of you were thinking about in the book, or what the purpose of this book is? You don't have to give away any details on the title or anything, but just some of like the general broad concepts on this, sharing of science and ideas around that.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, I should say it's a manuscript. It's in the process. It's one of those things where at the time that I thought I was around 70% done, because I was going to wrap it up in, the year 2019. More things occurred, which I said, what, this should actually wrap into it, and so on. I think where I landed is that for me, the endpoint that I'm going to shoot for is the end of this study. That I'm going to start from that fateful moment I told you about in November of 2015, going all the way up until 2022, or actually it'll be 2023, 2024, whenever the study meets to a point where I feel like I can start wrapping the book, because there is a kind of story within a story here. It's, at first I thought I would just be keeping it straight up to the science, but I think that there's a lot of value in examining the process of science today. And for that matter, how much of a difference I had in my understanding of how it was working coming from the outside to what I think now. So I think a lot of us have, certainly I did, I had a more, I call it a Hollywoodized version of science. Anytime I see a character portrayed in a show or a movie, they're endlessly curious, and that student in the back who mentions something that sparks their mind to suddenly rethink everything that they had been teaching the last 15 years. And as I'm sure you know from being in this space, it's not quite like that. Yeah. A lot of times just because it's human nature, right? As humans, we have our worldview, and our worldview can get somewhat fixated. And it's actually a process that I think we have to learn to continually self-challenge, to continually confront core beliefs of ours, and to feel a need, to build a need, to look at all incoming challenges that seem to have traction building and not dismiss them, to try to understand why it is that this could be a genuine threat, if you want to say it that way, to some beliefs we have established. Because at the end of the day, we should care the most about the truth. I mean, science should be truth seeking. And again, I don't state this as a kind of indictment of the scientific community or this process overall. but that I get it. I get it now more than I ever did before, that we can kind of get caught in a network of like-minded individuals, such that even in the advent of information technology and social media, where you'd think information can flow pretty easily, there's still problems. There's still a lot of problems in trying to get advancements that truly are paradigm shifting. And I don't know for sure yet. I don't know if our model, or if lean mass hyperresponders for that matter, will prove to be a low risk group. But if they are, I think the story behind why it was so hard to get them to be studied in the first place is one worth telling.
Yeah, and with, I mean, if it's a well-designed experiment and the proper statistics are run, I mean, eventually at the end, when you run a well-done study, you would hope to, the answer you get, whether it is in support of kind of your hypothesis or in support of what one hopes. Obviously, the idea isn't to, you don't necessarily design a study to prove what you hope. And I think that is actually kind of maybe going back to like what people have an idea of, their idea of science is that, like, I think the Hollywood version is like, yes, scientist has an idea, they design this experiment and they test it and they try to prove what they thought was right all along. It's like, well, no, the real objective of science, you're supposed to try to disprove your hypothesis,
Right.
So you design with, when you design a study, the null is that, oh, there's nothing going on here. And then if you get enough data to support the alternative hypothesis that there is a difference, okay, well, then you have, maybe you have something there. And so I think that's just one of the main kind of misconceptions, is that, like, you don't design a study to try to prove something. A well-designed study is actually one that is trying to disprove whatever idea kind of you think you have. And again, you were just spot on about, like, even, scientists, but, the public especially doesn't really have a great idea of how difficult it is to truly run like a good experiment. And that's why you get so many studies saying, oh, well, not that, most of these aren't randomized trials, but like, oh, eggs are good or eggs are bad. And, we're going to have this conversation forever. Well, that's because, even one trial is going to be run one way in one population, one's going to be run one way in another population. You get two different results. And so one study doesn't make up a, totality of the evidence. You kind of need to take multiple studies spanning multiple decades. But yeah, it's just, the process is so difficult, not only to run, but also to understand. And I think that's why a lot of people who are sharing science, whether that be like a journalist or just somebody on Twitter, often also kind of get a lot of criticism, because it's like, oh, you interpreted the study wrong, or, you used a clickbaity headline. It's like, well, a lot of those journalists also aren't trained in science, and they're just kind of talking to the people who did the study. And it's a mess. Science isn't clean at all, and it never will be. And so, it's just, we kind of have to do the best that we can and use the best evidence to date. And luckily, kind of methods and scientific scrutiny, at least it seems like, are improving. And so, when we can be more confident kind of about what we find, maybe not, you're, scratching your head on that, but
there's a few, I'll just say it's hard to know. I'll say that I feel like one of the things that is improving in a material way that we can chart is transparency, which I feel very strongly about. But even so, that's super slow. It would be my preference that we had built in at some level, including from science journalist standpoint, an understanding of the spectrum of data and the confidence behind it. The problem is that I feel as though there's so much of a false dichotomy, particularly in nutrition science. It gets really tough for me. For the longest time, I used to think Bradford Hill was sort of a pushover criteria until I learned more about Bradford Hill. Now I'm pretty confident that if you could take Bradford Hill from back in time and bring him to today, he would say, look, 99.9% of the people who say that they've met my criteria, or at least have met a strong threshold of my criteria, are wrong. They've not. They haven't hit that. So a lot of times when there's a relative risk of 18%. You dig down into it and it's a 5% absolute versus 6% absolute. And then from that, we're going to jump to the conclusion that this proves causality. Like, I just skip over that. That's not as interesting to me, because that, I don't feel like that gives as strong of a case of confidence. So the problem is that it still has an impact. It still generates a level of excitement and funding and potential products around those findings so that they can then showcase what the findings of that study were. It advances the careers of those people who get more excitement around that, right? Such that it takes away the incentive to do exactly what you're talking about, the more methodical, more intensive studies. But yeah, that's my one concern. And the one other aspect that I wish got greater scrutiny are adjustments and models. I feel like there's a lot of scrutiny on the data and the means of data collection, but there's a lot of creativity and latitude that's available after data has been collected as to how it is that you adjust it and change it and modify it from how it originated. And I wish that there was more standards of uniformity and aspects like that were applied in that case. So that may be an area where I'm a little less optimistic, but who knows? That may be changing over time as well.
Yeah, I think that there is sort of this effort to, pre-register your study outcomes, pre-register your statistical analysis that you're going to use, so that you can't do exactly what you just said, which is decide what outcomes I want to look at or report after this data have been collected, or decide which statistical analyses I want to use after the data are collected, because that just opens up. I mean, if you have a data set, you can p-hack away and do whatever you want until you find some sort of association. I mean, run enough tests, you're going to find a significant result. Run enough correlations, you're going to find a significant association. I mean, and then there's something to report. So I think that the pre-registration, I'm not, in really deep into kind of, the science statistics world and things like that. But I do feel like that there's an effort for that to be done, because there have been some like large scale studies I know published previously where it's like, well, you're reporting outcomes that you didn't say you were going to report, and all kinds of stuff. Again, just making it more messy. So, I mean,
I have an opinion on that, by the way. And this isn't my idea, but when I was first looking into this, the concept of not only pre-registration, but a commitment to publication in advance, I think just straight solves this. If the publication of interest works with the trialists or whatever the research effort is, and they agree in advance before the data is in hand, that not only here's what the analysis is that'll be applied, but we'll publish it, whatever the results are, whether they're negative, whether they're positive. And you know what? It's fine if post hoc you want to say, hey, we found these other interesting things, but the endpoints of interest remain. They need to be determined in advance, and we need to hold to this, because that'll actually truly progress the science the most if we're holding everyone to be the most honest about it, rather than to feel the sense. Again, I don't want to say honest because that suggests wrongdoing per se, but I think that there certainly is a lot of pressure, and it's not just me saying this. This is a lot of scientists that'll say this. There's a lot of pressure to publish and to find novel findings, and to make them out to be as big as possible. And a lot of times it's a challenge, because if they know that that's what the publications are looking for, what the publishers are looking for, then that's part of the problem.
It would certainly reduce a lot of the pressure, maybe not to, again, we're not saying that people are, forging their results or making up things just to get it published, but taking maybe some statistical liberty, I guess, is a good way to put it. If you knew beforehand, like you said, that this article is going to be published, regardless of whether we find something that supports, that this had a beneficial effect, or whether it showed nothing. Because yeah, there's a pressure to publish novel findings, but I think the pressure to just publish something is kind of more of a pressure for scientists. So if I can publish this paper in the journal and is going to accept it regardless of whether we find, we'll call it nothing, then that's great. There's not really an incentive to p-hack. I mean, of course you might want to find a novel result, but if you can get a paper published for a null finding, then great. You still have a publication to your name, and you still ran a well-controlled experiment. and you're not contributing to this publication bias in science, which is, yeah, there's more of a bias towards publishing positive results versus negative results. And that's just not a, a fault of the scientists. It's a fault of the journals themselves. I mean, we've submitted in our lab multiple papers to journals and who are like, oh, we're not going to publish this finding. It's because, well, we found no effect of whatever intervention we were doing. This exercise didn't improve whatever outcome we were looking at. It's like,
but that is a finding, right?
It is, right. No finding is a finding, and a lot of people don't understand that. Right. Yeah. So
it's so unfortunate because it could be so crucial to advancing that very area you're looking into.
Exactly.
Because we need to be able to see the counterbalance for those. So yes, this is a place where I can get a bit vocal, even though I feel careful about it, because of course, once again, I'm not formally trained. I'm brand new to this space. I don't want to be somebody who's overly critical when I'm not really in the industry and can understand all the aspects of it to the same degree as somebody who's been in it for decades. But that said, I know scientists who have been in it for decades, who have published these kinds of editorials, that this is a serious problem and that we should make better efforts towards fixing this, especially the publishers.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think anybody who has tried to publish a scientific manuscript or has published one or reviewed them, or maybe they sit on a journal editorial board, would admit freely that, sure, publishing has its, they're great things, but this fact that like journals are maybe hesitant to accept a finding of no finding is sort of, rampant and not doing any good to science. Because like we just said, I mean, as much as we want to find cool things that work, does this enhance lifespan? Does this whatever? I also want to know, what doesn't work? Does resveratrol doesn't work? I want to know that too, so that we don't waste our time and that we don't waste our research dollars into further maybe investigating something that we showed to have, no effect. And most of the time people are really just trying to push as hard as they can to show something that works. So you see very little headlines about X doesn't work or has no effect. And we probably need more of those, to be honest.
We 100% need more of those, or at least to say the science isn't clear. Why don't we have more articles that look more like what review papers look like, right? We're saying, look, here's where things are at. And I know that takes a lot more work. That's another issue. And this isn't just with science journalism, this is just journalism overall, is I feel as though they kind of count on Twitter to be just sort of the general research effort that's placed. And unfortunately, Twitter, as somebody who uses Twitter all the time, it placates to the loudest voices, and oftentimes the loudest voices with the time to spare to press into it. And that's, this kind of gets back to the arc of what we were talking about before. How can we leverage social media in the ways that it's good for, which is networking? Like I didn't meet Nick Norwitz, my collaborator on the recent papers with the Lipid Energy Model, till after we had actually published 3 papers together. And thank you, social media, for helping to make this collaboration possible. But by the same token, I see kind of the mob effect that often happens, not just in science, but in everything with social media that can be problematic, but especially if it's something with regard to a field that cares a lot about accuracy and nuance, as science should. And so I want that, getting back to science journalists should be some of the most sciencey minded people of us. They should care so much about wanting to get the objectivity in place, more so than other journals, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I think sometimes you will see science journalists with a background in science, and I think that's a huge kind of, upgrade, from a traditional journalist. You might just have going from a journalism background into the science versus kind of the other way around, a scientist who maybe expanded their writing skills and their journalism skills and now is able to kind of understand the science more. I see a lot of that. And, scientists now publishing kind of popular books, which is also great to see, because then they can sort of distill these real hard concepts down into a level with some accuracy still. So yeah, I mean, there's still, a lot of work to be done. And I know, you did mention, way earlier in the conversation that you are, I don't think on Twitter you try to be as cordial as you can, and I would, agree with that. And that when I see you interacting with everybody, you're never really defensive, as defensive as you might need to be, but never sort of on the attack, which I think helps kind of your credibility, because when you see people just lashing out, I don't think that really does any good to change anyone's mind. So I commend you on that. So I want to digress a little bit. We had a great conversation on social media science and science communication. I do want to get into though some of your models, particularly the Lipid Energy Model, and then talk about the cool study that you have going on. I definitely wanted to leave some time for that. So, digressing back, to what we were talking about at cholesterol earlier in our conversation, you mentioned the Lipid Energy Model multiple times. So, can you just basically briefly describe this model for listeners who may not be familiar with the work, and sort of, we talked about maybe kind of the origin of it, but sort of, what led you to develop this model, and sort of what's some of the essential tenets of it are?
Sure. So I'm going to do my best to give an elevator pitch. I know from having listened to some of your podcasts, a little bit of your demographics, so hopefully I'm going to hit somewhere in the middle there. But we talk a lot about metabolism. Metabolism is really the balance between anabolism, which is the building up of stuff, and catabolism, which is the breaking down of stuff. And more than anything else, we're usually talking about that in terms of fuel. So your fuel stores for glucose are glycogen in the liver and skeletal muscle. Your fuel stores for fat are adipocytes, the fat cells. Okay, well, if you're someone like me, you go keto, your carbs are low, so your hepatic glycogen stores get low. Well, the body signals, hey, we need to actually activate more trafficking of fatty acids, because clearly this human operating system is running this other version where it's going to be using a lot more fatty acids. That means adipocytes need to be engaged more. They need to have stuff moved into them more and taken out of them more. Well, the difference between glucose and fatty acids is glucose is what's known as water soluble. It means it can come into the bloodstream and it doesn't need any help. It's ready to swim. Whereas fatty acids are like oil and water. Chemically, it's exactly like oil and water. It's not going to, it's hydrophobic, hydro being water, phobic being fearing. So what your body does is it makes these carrier proteins. They're basically Uber, right, for your bloodstream. And they attach to these fatty acids so that they can move. And the one that doesn't get talked about a lot is albumin. You may be familiar with albumin. Our body makes a lot of these and makes sure they're in the bloodstream. And you can almost think of them as kind of like a life raft that the fatty acids, they grab onto the life raft. And that's great because if some other tissues need those fatty acids, they can pull in the whole thing, the fatty acid and the life raft of albumin. However, a lot of that also makes its way to the liver. What the liver does is it takes a lot of those fatty acids and it packages them into the storage form of fatty acids, which is triglycerides. It's 3 fatty acids with a glycerol backbone. And they're big and bulky, so they stay within this membrane that we have that it makes called a lipoprotein, which you can kind of think of as short for lipid carrying protein. And the one that the liver makes is called a VLDL, very low density lipoprotein. So when it goes back out of the liver's put a bunch of these guys together. So it's a giant energy tanker, right? So it's not just the little life raft I was just talking about with albumin. Now you've got 2,500 of these triglycerides on board this VLDL, and it goes out. And again, because I'm powered by fat, my cells are going to take a bunch of those, almost like a giant buffet table getting passed around. They're going to take a bunch of the triglycerides off through a complex process that I won't go into. I know I'm already getting a little complicated, but
This is great, yeah.
Yeah, but that reduction of those fatty acids remodels VLDL into the very famous LDL, low density lipoprotein. And when it does, that means that because you're trafficking everything I just described, there's that whole cycle is now increased. That means that you're going to have more of these boats, if you will, these lipoproteins that have successfully dropped off these triglycerides. or at least you hope that they were successful. That suggests probably more of a healthy lipid metabolism. So in the process of dropping off these triglycerides, there's just more boats remaining in circulation. Now, the lipid energy model, to take it one step further, things I didn't know, but 5-6 years ago when I was first doing this, as to why my HDL went up and my triglycerides went down while consuming a lot more fat, is that actually my insulin moved up, at least somewhat. In doing so, that stimulated more uptake in my adipocytes. Makes sense. You're consuming more food. Even if you're ketogenic, that means more is going to go into your fat cells, right? Well, that activity of taking the triglycerides off, that is predominantly focused on something called lipoprotein lipase. It's a special enzyme that takes it off. And the activity, the turnover of lipoprotein lipase results in more HDL and more HDL cholesterol. The reason, and this is what's kind of fascinating, a lot of people didn't know this, and this includes me, is that as a VLDL is getting smaller, dropping off these triglycerides, it has to shed its parts, its surface area. And that surface area is picked up by what's waiting in the wings, a whole bunch of nascent HDL particles that start small and get big, picking up a lot of those components, phospholipids and free cholesterol and so forth, right? And the reason the triglycerides got smaller is because I'm quite literally putting them away. I'm shelving them. So I'm in a state of anabolism, to take it all the way back to the beginning. Reason my LDL cholesterol is going down in the context of being ketogenic is because I'm quite literally packing them away into these adipocytes, while that whole process that turns that over quickly feeds both the HDL species so that that pool gets larger, and the triglycerides are actually disappearing because they're quite literally being taken up into the stores of the adipocytes. So hopefully, because I know you probably have a little bit more of a university audience, so I could probably say aloud what I did. Hopefully you followed most of that, but let me know if you have any questions, anything I just said. Is that a decent elevator pitch?
Yeah, no, that was a great elevator pitch. And I was trying to, I'm sure you have I will refer people to like your website to watch maybe some videos where you kind of have diagrams about these that could be very helpful. And I can even put some in the show notes. I guess a couple of the questions, that I guess I just have about the lipid energy model, because again, it's something that I would love to understand more about myself. The essential, I guess, thing is that, yes, if you're eating a lot of fat, you obviously have more fat that is going to be taken up into adipocytes. That those triglycerides, though, and fatty acids are also going to be taken up, though, I would assume, by skeletal muscle tissue, et cetera, since someone is essentially using that fat for energy rather than, say, primarily glucose if they're on, say, like a low carbohydrate diet.
Definitely, yes. And while I didn't cover that part of it, I was mainly focusing on adipocytes. Generally speaking, your skeletal muscle, especially your cardiac muscle and so forth, they are going to be utilizing more of these fatty acids. Another piece that I left out but is relevant is, of course, the keto diet itself means more of those fatty acids will also have the fate in the liver of being converted to ketone bodies, which is important for fueling the brain as well. But yes, generally speaking, your tissues, your non-adipocytes, are generally going to be using more fatty acids for fuel now relative to glucose.
Right. And so basically, based on this model, reason that you see, and I guess, so just so I have my directions correct, it's, the LDL would go up as well as HDL, but triglycerides are down. Is that correct?
Yes, but I want to kind of caveat a couple of things real quick.
Sure.
So the example I gave was what we would expect in somebody who's metabolically healthy. If somebody's already has other metabolic challenges, we already know this via other means even before the model, then their lipid profile looks different, which goes back to the things I was talking about from a little bit earlier, right? So assuming you're more metabolically healthy, however, it is worth emphasizing that if you're both metabolically healthy but not on a low carb diet, you may have lower triglycerides anyway, in the same reason you would have, say, lower than expected glucose, even though you might be consuming high amounts of carbs. Why? Because your body is successful in utilizing of that energy and or putting it away for staging and pacing.
Right. So, and somebody who was not metabolically healthy, say, who ate the same as someone who was metabolically healthy, would you perhaps see would the changes be different, or would the changes be the same, but perhaps the effects on physiology different? Meaning that, I guess the assumption maybe here, and maybe we'll get into that later, is that these increases in LDL, increases in, I guess just the increase in LDL are sort of a physiological adaptation. Demand increases, so the supply needs to also increase. And somebody who's metabolically unhealthy, though, would that maybe not necessarily be a case of the increased demand causing those numbers to rise versus something maybe going awry?
Well, and that's an interesting question for a number of different reasons. Getting back to how I think of metabolically healthy versus not metabolically healthy, I'm talking about it from a success and failure standpoint. Are you successful in your counterbalancing between anabolism and catabolism? I think most people would agree, hey, this high amount of glucose alongside high amount of triglycerides, we know that those are usually fuel that's being stored. Seems as though there's a failure to store that fuel, so it's building up in the bloodstream. Now, here's where things get a lot more complicated and where there may be a lot of arguments, but generally speaking, we all agree that a high presence of that over time is going to lead to something called ectopic fat. And ectopic fat is going to be the buildup of fat, and this also may be somewhat controversial to say, but I think colloquially we could say is going into tissues that are not designed to store fat at those levels. Something, for example, so a good example is visceral adipocyte hypertrophy. Hypertrophy being, large size. If you have large sized adipocytes in your visceral fat, bad sign. And it tends to associate with lower HDL, higher triglycerides, and marginally higher LDL particles, right? But especially higher ApoB, ApoB being the major protein that are on VLDLs and LDLs. Okay, so someone like me comes along and I'm like, is it possible that some association of the higher ApoB in those who are metabolically unhealthy is part of this whole milieu? Because we're seeing atherogenic dyslipidemia alongside this higher level of ApoB that was created. Again, we're seeing a change to it, right? Why not then look at those people who seem to be not even necessarily on a ketogenic diet, but who seem to be seemingly metabolically healthy, but on just even a marginally higher fat, lower carb diet? Maybe they weren't even trying to be on Atkins. Is it possible that that higher ApoB is due to successful trafficking as opposed to unsuccessful trafficking? Because I'm offering a way by which you could have either one, but for different reasons. Yet, for a core common reason of metabolic failure or success. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it makes sense. You introduced ApoB, and so ApoB levels, do they, I guess I know ApoB is sort of not necessarily a new thing, but something that people are like focusing on. But when you bring that up and say that this is kind of being used as a diagnostic kind of thing too, does that tend to just parallel, like, say, LDL levels, or why is ApoB, I guess, relevant to the discussion?
So ApoB is relevant to the discussion because you probably heard of discordance, where people, for example, don't have a high LDL cholesterol, but yet do have a high ApoB or high LDL particle count, right? The Lipid Energy Model might give a glimpse into why that exact scenario could be possible. And why then would you have a whole bunch of particles that would be remaining in circulation, yet their LDL cholesterol levels are lower? Well, typically it's because those boats that are supposed to be successfully delivering triglycerides are failing to deliver the triglycerides. And so getting back to the load balancing, there's another component to this, and I know we're getting a bit complex here, but it's called cholesterol ester transfer protein. Cholesterol ester transfer protein actually does exchanges between particles in the bloodstream. What you end up having is an interesting composition where you have a lot of particles that are triglyceride rich and cholesterol poor in those who have severe metabolic syndrome. and atherogenic dyslipidemia. So it looks from the outside, it's like, oh, well, the LDL cholesterol is, low enough and manageable, but their triglycerides are super high. Yet you look at the particle count is pretty high. Well, going by the existing lipid hypothesis, that alone should be the reason why we would see the higher rates of cardiovascular disease, because the particle is a particle, right? But now, again, this is why it's important, I think, for us to look at people who seemingly are metabolically healthy and successful at the delivering of those triglycerides. Is you go into lean mass hyperresponders, and I predict that we're going to find that the composition of their boats is the opposite, that the triglycerides are low, triglyceride poor, and cholesterol rich, that their LDL-C is going to be very high alongside their LDL-P being very high, and thus their ApoB will be very high. But I would argue that the reason for the higher number of particles, the higher number of boats, is the original thing I was just describing. In a seemingly metabolically healthy environment, it's because there's successful turnover resulting in more of those boats, but for a different reason.
Right, more boats to transfer more particles versus more boats that just have loaded with particles that kind of haven't reached their destination or have nowhere to go because the person is not metabolically healthy, essentially.
Yes, and that's the key distinction. The word I hope I can leave you with to carry on with other people when talking about this is success versus failure. Does this seem to be a successful turnover of triglycerides by ApoB containing lipoproteins? If yes, then now I want to see with that diversion, whether they're on a ketogenic diet or whatever diet they were on, what their association of risk is with the higher and higher levels of ApoB. Because thus far, we're informed the most by populations that have some form of dysfunction in lipid metabolism. So let's find out what happens when that dysfunction doesn't exist.
Yeah, I mean, like we mentioned earlier, the majority of what we know about it's the association or the causal relationship of LDL and heart disease, it's in people who are quote unquote unsuccessful in kind of this paradigm that you're talking about. So I guess a final thing before we then move on, and we will talk about then the study, but in people who are also metabolically unhealthy and have this unsuccessful kind of like lipid transport mechanism, I would also assume that they have unsuccessful metabolism in a lot of other respects as well. And so, what could you maybe just comment on the role of like other maybe risk factors in terms of like glucose and insulin and things like that? Because I'm sure those sort of sometimes probably get discounted and we focus on, say, LDL particles and causing heart disease. But, another way to differentiate these successful versus unsuccessful individuals, not that the individuals themselves are unsuccessful, but what we were talking about earlier, they, the metabolically healthy individuals are going to be insulin sensitive and probably have normal blood glucose. Those who are with the unsuccessful kind of phenotype, high levels of insulin, high levels of blood glucose. So, what's maybe the compounding effect of like all of these risk factors on increasing the disease? Do you think that, probably has a role here to play as well?
Absolutely. In many respects, I often look to triglycerides as being, as I would jokingly call it, a poor man's very loose proxy for insulin resistance and hyperinsulinemia. Is if you're not already testing for fasting insulin, and I strongly feel people should, if your triglycerides are high, you should want to know why. And this isn't to say that triglycerides couldn't be high for another reason. For example, they now take a lot of non-fasted blood work, which I'm not a huge fan of. I think you should always get your blood work fasted, me personally. But if you're low carb and you get a blood work, 3 hours after you just had a fatty meal and your triglycerides are high, you literally installed the triglycerides into your bloodstream coming from your gut. So don't be surprised by that. But if you're 12 hours fasted, your triglycerides should not be high. Why would your triglycerides be high at like 12 hours fasted? Well, there are other things that may impact that, but I would want to know more. And fasting insulin is a good way of doing that. I don't want to hang my hat on any particular marker because I think you should look at them all together, especially with lipids. But in the case of insulin, I've never heard a good reason. Nobody's ever presented one to me that I can think of for why a fasted insulin test, as in you've been fasted for 12 hours to 14 hours, why it would be high. If it's high, it's a state of anabolism. You're in a state of storage. Why would you be in a state of storage after not having consumed anything in that span of time? Now, there are many disease states that can result in a higher level of insulin. And that's actually important for the immune response, which we could set aside for now. But the point is, if everything seems fine, all systems go, but you have high fasting insulin, I think that that's worth taking a look at, because I think that that does suggest that you have a system failure of sorts. And it's worth tackling, because at that point, whatever diet you decide to go down, or whatever environmental changes you need to make, I think it's worth really taking a look at that point.
No, that's I think great for people to know. And insulin, I think, often maybe gets discounted a little bit. We often just think about it in the context of blood glucose, but it's, aside from its like role in several other like physiological processes, I just think, like you said, it could be an important biomarker, because it's involved in so much more than just, blood glucose regulation. And it's not just, a diabetes, a hormone that gets wrong in diabetes. So speaking now then of these lean mass hyperresponders that we've already mentioned. So this, goes along with the lipid energy model, but you also have this phenotype of individual that you have referred to as lean mass hyperresponders. So can you sort of describe this phenotype and how it relates to the lipid energy model? And then after that, we can get into the study that you actually have going on, which is very exciting, and I've kind of been following pretty closely.
Well, great. Yes. So the reason quite literally, it was pattern recognition. So here I am back in 2017, as I was talking about before. I'd given the Breckenridge talk. I'd had the beginnings of what I was considering to be the lipid energy model, but I was still far away from understanding the physiology and seeing it in the way that I do today. But the process of more and more people reaching out to me and sharing their data led me to recognize more and more of these aspects that were worth me paying attention to. So one of the first people that reached out to me, who was like, I just have ridiculous cholesterol levels. Her cholesterol levels, I want to say, were like 600, her total cholesterol was, I want to say, 600 or 700. And her LDL was around like 500, 600, something along those lines. It was the first time I had ever heard of anybody with this. And her HDL was extremely high, higher than I had ever heard of by that point in time. It was, I want to say, maybe 112, 130, something along those lines. And I kept thinking about it, and I kept wanting to understand it better. And we kept having a dialogue going back and forth. And one of the things that I realized in chatting back and forth with her and trying to talk about different aspects was she was very, very thin. She was very thin enough to where that was something she was actively trying to change and work on, and particularly in building more muscle and things along those lines. But the more that was on my radar, the more I saw other people coming forward. And that actually was where this phenotype came before the energy model. Because it's not like I was just thinking, oh, maybe it's this and this and this. Maybe here's what the phenotype is that I'll expect to see, is the other way.
Oh, right. You use the model to sort of explain the phenotype that you were seeing. Yeah.
Which, by the way, is quite common in science. I mean, metabolic syndrome is teaching us, after many of its, cut points were recognized and looked after, as to why this is so ubiquitous and so common. Well, so I write the article in July of 2017, and there's one thing that I did speculate on. I speculated on then, recognizing how this works and then getting the early beginnings of the model. I was like, the more that I think about it, the more this should probably apply to children. I haven't gotten a lot of children that have turned around information to me. And I speculate, if just following this logically, children tend to have higher metabolism. Children tend to have lower levels of LDL. If you ever watch Lifetime, children start much lower than we do. And by the way, I think that's also due to, in part due to also higher anabolism. They're growing, and part of growing is you're actually endocytosing, a lot of it to some degree. But I'll bet that there would be a lot of children who would be lean mass hyperresponders if I just follow this logically. And sure enough, there were a lot of children that turned out to have that. A lot of people who found the article after the fact and were saying, oh yes, what children get cholesterol tests? Children who unfortunately have a medical reason to be on special diets and so forth. And in keto's case, this is epileptics. And so to this day, it's the children, honestly, that have some of the biggest drive for me. Like, I feel like we've really got to get this risk question answered, because a lot of epileptic children, keto has been life-changing. And I mean life-changing to the extent to where everything is great, except their cholesterol levels are super high.
Yeah, that's something I never thought about, is that, that whole, again, like the trade-off thing that like you were seeing with improving your metabolic health, like the keto children who are epileptic, who are on keto, because I mean, they're truly eating, the highest fat diet, possible. I mean, like a true 100%. Clinical kind of like ketogenic diet. So yeah, I've actually never thought about it in respect to children. So it's interesting that that you bring that up.
And so it's a tough question, right? A lot of these parents, they're coming from a place where keto has allowed them to get their child off of a lot of medication. They're so excited to finally see the blood work. And it's just like they're me in 2015. They expect everything to look great. And here's the cholesterol through the roof. They're Googling cholesterol and keto. They come across me and I don't have a straight answer for them. Like somebody's saying, hey, is my child at a high risk? My answer is, I don't know. I mean, I can tell you what conventional medicine would say, but that was the point. 2017 was the point at which I was thinking, you know what, I've got to just find a way to make this study happen where we just look. And so in 2019, 2 years later, after again trying to talk to a lot of lipidologists, trying to raise money in private to get a study going and just getting nowhere, I eventually decided to crowdsource it. So I just announced to the low carb community. It still amazes me that I did this to this day, because I had no idea what was going to happen. I said, look, I need a lot of money because studies cost a lot of money. I think I could do this for maybe $2,000 per lean mass hyperresponder, get them scanned twice with the span of time over, so that it's longitudinal data. We would get a CT angiogram at day 0 and get another one for 5 years later. And then we'd have a 5-year prospective longitudinal study. And so I started raising money, and I connected with Spencer Nadolsky and Tommy Wood. And then we eventually met Dr. Matt Budoff, pitching him this study. And he says, no, we only need to be at 1 year. We're like, 1 year? That's like way too short, right? He's like, no, at their exposure levels, at 1 year, it was more than enough time. At 190 LDL and up, if we can get, 40 or 50 people, like the advancement in CT angiography is at such a level to where soft, non-calcified plaque, its change can be detected over time better than ever before. And yes, if they were comparable to people who had homozygous FH, it's heartbreaking, but they're children. They're very young children. That this is the basis of Brown and Goldstein, who we would see not just plaque development, but symptomatic heart disease at like age 3, right? Developing a stable angina, showing xanthomas, and again, heartbreaking, but they might have their first heart attack at like age 5 or 6 or something like that. Well, I personally know a lot of lean mass hyperresponders that are at those levels, that I emphasize to them, this is uncharted territory. And just so you know, we even have a paper out this year that if you can tolerate carbohydrates, it doesn't take much. It fits the model, the energy model, that with a little bit more carbohydrates, we assume you're repleting your hepatic glycogen stores and you're changing that signal that I was talking about from earlier, such that you're intentionally being powered a bit more by carbohydrates and therefore a bit less by fatty acids and therefore a bit less trafficking, right? And some people go that route, but some people are like epileptics, where no dice, they cannot have the carbs or they're gonna have more seizures. And many of those folks, they're like, you know what, it's my choice. I'm taking this chance, but please get this data for us, right? A lot of them, by the way, are in this study that I'm talking about. So yes,
a lot of them aren't epileptics, right? It's just people who are interested in doing like low carb, keto, carnivore, for whatever reason.
True. Yeah. And to be sure, a lot of them didn't believe in the lipid hypothesis long before I came around anyway.
Mm-hmm.
And they were like, no, this is the best I've ever felt in my life. And again, we don't know what we don't know, which is why we just need to go get this data. I was, and I've stated this many times before, I was uncomfortable with there not being any action taken to get prospective data on this. More recently, there have been some case studies that have been published, but I'm not as much a fan of case studies, even though we've published a case study, because it's limited by our own selection bias. Getting back to worldview, we're looking for what we expect, even unconsciously. So prospective data is the best. Knowing what we know about homozygous FH children, if we know people who already have high LDL and they're going to have high LDL anyway, they're turning away treatment or other options. Hey, at least come to our study, get scanned, and they get scanned again a year later, and then we'll report the data and see what everyone decides.
And so what's the age range of participants you're enrolling? And so it's a year-long study. What's sort of the age range of participants?
It's age 18 and up. If you're an adult, you can join our study. And I'm pretty sure we have a good cross-section, even though I'm technically blinded. A lot of people on our groups say, hey, I got accepted to the study. I don't actually even know who gets accepted, who doesn't, and so forth, other than what they share in the Facebook group. By the way, this is a little bit of a problem and a solution with our study. Ideally, everybody would be blinded from everybody else. But in the Lundquist Institute, which is the one Matt Budoff runs that's running the study, they have commented on this, that the upside is that it's very easy for us to recruit and get people because it's a tight community. The downside is it's a tight community, so they talk to each other. Sure. So there's some pros and cons to that when trying to, make a scientific study happen, which ideally people wouldn't influence each other's behavior.
Yeah, I'm sure you'll maybe get some people, hey, Dave, I'm in your study. It's like, no, don't tell me. I'm not supposed to know that. But yeah, that is very funny. One of the drawbacks of being in the tight community. Easy enrollment for sure, because you have people, I'm sure, who would probably pay to be in your study. But then the drawback is kind of the blinding and sort of the.
Well, that was also another issue, because there were lots of people who said, look, I know you're doing this on a shoestring budget and so forth. I'm happy enough to pay for my own flight and Uber and all that sort of stuff. But there's a confounder in there, which is that means that they're going to be higher socioeconomic status. Right. And I would be critical of this if a study was only taking people who could afford to travel across the country to get their, twice to get their scans. So even if they could afford it, I would say we still need to pay for it so that we can at least confirm that there's no, natural bias built in that fashion.
No, that for sure. And even when you're kind of removing that bias, I mean, in general, you just sort of have this selection bias in general of people who would want to be in this study in general are going to have a certain set of characteristics probably, but that's, just something that you can't really, get around. I mean, there's going to be a selection bias for studies like that anyway. People who volunteer for studies tend to be, of a certain type of person, depending on what the study is. But, again, you can't erase sort of all of those maybe confounding variables. But I mean, it sounds, again, it's very exciting that the study is being done. And what's kind of the current status of the study at the moment? Is it ongoing? So you're actively recruiting? And
we're actively recruiting. We have I can't say yet how many people we have recruited, but we're about to do a new surge for more recruitment. I can tell you we have scanned quite a lot of people, and it's pretty exciting. But once the last person is scanned, you can just take it from there. It's going to be 1 year from when that person's second scan takes place. That's when we're going to start doing the longitudinal analysis. And there's, the possibility of more news before then, but I can't make any promises. There's a point where I get to talk to the principal investigator, and after we're, past a certain threshold, and what he would like to do, but it's ultimately his call.
Great. Well, all this is super exciting. And so just maybe thinking about the future. So when whatever results of this study gets published, I see a case where, so let's just say for the sake of the thought experiment, you find that, in these lean mass hyperresponders, they don't necessarily have this kind of adverse plaque progression. So on the one hand, you're going to get the low carb enthusiasts who are saying, oh, great, this is good news. This is evidence that keto isn't harmful. I can go along eating the way I do. My cardiovascular long-term risk is not going to be negatively impacted. Then you're going to have the people who are sort of in the opposite camp. They're going to say, oh, okay, well, yeah, you didn't show any harm, but the study wasn't long enough, so it's sort of a lose-lose scenario where, well, not a lose-lose scenario, but, you're not going to make everybody happy. So, how maybe do you plan to like confront that, or what are your thoughts on like, how you might try to kind of discuss these findings, whatever they may be, because they're not going to satisfy both parties kind of at once?
Well, that actually goes back to also what we talked about earlier. I know what the endpoints of interest are. And even in the announcement of the study, I've described what I think the study is going to be good at showing and what it's not going to be good at showing. So let's take it to its primary endpoint, which is at a population level, non-calcified plaque. So plaque volume at a population level, is it going to increase relative to what our expectations are for, say, age-matched cohorts, et cetera, right? And what we can glean from that is where the lipid hypothesis stands right now. I presented the work of Brown and Goldstein. I mentioned earlier in this podcast about, for example, the children that they were looking at, who again were symptomatic in a matter of years. Well, I'm sure you've seen regression after regression of, hey, if your LDL is this high, then in a shorter time, you're going to see this much effect. It's effect versus time, right? That's what I would call the horseshoes and hand grenades question that we can answer fairly quickly, which is, look, compared to, say, people with FH, would we see a pronounced signal? We should, given the existing lipid hypothesis. If we're looking at folks who, the entry criteria is 190 milligrams per deciliter, but I'm sure we're going to have some folks, for example, who are 300, 400, 500 even LDL. Should we see a clear and pronounced increase of plaque such to answer that horseshoes and hand grenades question, such as the magnitude doesn't seem to match what our expectations are for the existing lipid hypothesis? Yeah, we'll actually get a sense of it, at least with this prospective data. And conversely, if you're somebody who's arguing, well, wait a sec, I will predict that lean mass hyperresponders are in fact low risk on the whole, but that they would have been lower risk, at least to some small margin, if their LDL were low. I'm more than upfront in advance that our study will not be good at answering that question, because we need a good control group, and we need to get to that level of granularity, right? So this is the beginning of a conversation, not the end of one. However, the beginning is super important, because right now, lean mass hyperresponders across the world are not hearing anything along the lines of, well, I think you're very low risk, but suboptimal. That's absolutely new information, extraordinarily new information, because that's not the expectation right now. If you're a lean mass hyperresponder with an LDL of 400 showing up in your doctor's office, odds are, and we know this because they come to the groups and relay these stories, your doctor will say something like, this is the highest LDL I've ever seen, right, in my practice. A lot of them will say this. And again, we don't have an answer for them. Is it at least something where you could say low risk, even if suboptimal, versus high risk? Right now, that's not the expectation. The expectation is, no, it's high risk, you're in immediate danger, and we can expect that you are going to be developing plaque, or at least that it's highly likely you're going to be developing plaque at a very rapid pace. And that, of course, is something that we should at least get an answer to quickly, because it should be something that's easy to answer given the magnitude of effect.
Yeah, definitely. Step one, answer kind of that important question, because that can set a lot of these kind of people at ease, and, a very important question to answer. And like you said, this will just only kind of lead the way to, whatever future studies may be. Maybe these same people come back and they change their diet and introduce some more carbohydrates and do another year-long study, and maybe you get some more crowdfunding. But again, it's, step by step by step. And I think that the fact that you pointed out, there are some questions that the study will answer, some that it won't. It's very important because oftentimes people will just want to lump all of these conclusions into a study where the study wasn't necessarily designed to answer that. So you being upfront about these are the main questions of interest, this is what the study actually is powered to answer, designed to answer, whatever. I think being upfront about that before anything comes out and before kind of even the study is, finished is I think a responsible kind of way to conduct science. So again, very exciting, and congrats on kind of getting that study up and running. I know, even a year or so ago, you were talking about it, and now that it's up and running, it's very cool to see. And it sounds like you got a good thing going.
Yeah, thanks. Well, and I mean, hats off to the community. I couldn't have done it without a whole lot of, sort of getting back to the themes we were talking about at the beginning of this podcast. Social media is a big part of the story. Were it not for me to be able to not only talk about this hypothesis, but to help identify this phenotype, for the phenotype to have that relaying effect to where we could ultimately build the group, to where we could talk out what's possible. But that level of collaboration at this speed with people who are not already in the field of science really does speak, I think, a lot to the concept of citizen science. It is tricky, and it's worth emphasizing that the challenge is to still try to, counterbalance that with considerations of safety, of emphasis that these are ideas being explored but are not yet established. And that's not easy. That's hard to do. But I think it's important. And I think this is where we can kind of set good examples, hopefully.
Yeah, it's important, and certainly it's hard, but in the long run, I definitely think worth it. But just showing there's not many kind of studies of this kind where, like you said, it kind of began from this almost like grassroots movement. So it's cool just to see the accessibility of science for that people can be both involved in, not only as participants, but also in kind of designing, the study, getting involved, and actually paying, for the study, through their own money. And getting people invested in that can certainly stir up the excitement. So I think that's great. And then, last question just for you, kind of unrelated to the study, but, we've talked all, about nutrition and metabolism kind of this whole time. And so I'm just curious, you've done so many experiments on yourself, eating, high saturated fat and whatnot. I'm just curious, what's your diet like now that you've, likely gone through so many iterations of this through your own testing and, through, decades and decades, but what does your diet look like these days? And is it something that you're trying to sustain, or are you still sort of experimenting with different types of things?
Yeah, so I was originally militant keto for, I want to say, maybe the first 2-3 years. And now I balance between keto and low carb. And let me kind of define that a little bit more. I think of keto as, or at least keto for me, as under 30 grams of carbs a day. And low carb, I would roughly say, is anywhere under 80 grams of carbs a day, with occasionally I'll have something that's above 80 on not a cheat day, but like a cheat meal maybe. But even then, it's not a big cheat. Like my version of a cheat might be, I don't know, I'll have a French dip with a real bun, right? But I'm not going to add fries or chips or something like that. It's mainly the bun, but it's fairly sizable bun, right? But I'm fairly decent about not doing it often. I do think that there's a lot of amazing things I've learned from experimenting, doing diet experiments, in that I've come to understand better, because it's a chosen point in time of which there's a change, how much diet can impact mood. Because part of the problem is that I think a lot of times when, let's say, the holidays come around and people fall off their diet, and this includes myself, I would think, oh, well, it's because I was stressed at that time, and so-and-so had bought a pie, and she always loves it if we all consume together or something along those lines, and that's why I had a few bites. And then things kind of spin out and moods change, and you think that it was the mood that affected the diet. But when you have planned experiments where, okay, I'm going to do this added sugar experiment. This, by the way, actually happened, I want to say in 2018 or 2019. I had an added sugar experiment where I was keto all the way up until a certain point, and then I added dextrose in the form of bottle caps in a very controlled manner. that actually had one of the longest running problematic outcomes after the experiment was over. It was only for 4 days, but after those 4 days, I was craving junk food. And even though I tried to make it keto-like junk food or keto-friendly junk food, still junk food, by the way, I had a tough time getting back from it. And it wasn't a state that I was normally in, such that it really started getting me to think about how much behavior really can be impacted by diet. And then later that year, I had one carb swap experiment where it doesn't normally impact my mood that much. But on the very last day, I had this very strange effect where I became almost within 60 seconds, I became extremely pessimistic about everything in my life. Mm-hmm. And it lasted for around 18 to 24 hours, something like that. I actually kept track of it as it was going on, but I was impressed negatively at how much it was impacting everything in my life. Now, I've done so many experiments that I can say that rarely happens, but that I felt like it was impacted by these food changes I was making, that I feel very confident of. So I can't say much beyond that, but I can say that it's helped me to recognize that experiments where I really radically shift my diet from one thing to another seem to be at a higher risk of not just impacting like my weight and body composition, things like that, but do run the risk of literally changing my mood or my outlook or even my successive eating habits when I mean to change them back again. And I think that's a really fascinating area, but kind of hard to target with N of 1 experiments. So anyway,
but I mean, when you think about it, it's like you literally are, I mean, especially if you're doing, say, drastic changes in macronutrient composition or something. I mean, you're literally changing, the composition of your gut microbiome, which we know a lot of neurotransmitters are produced in the gut. You're changing, neurotransmitters in your brain. So it's like, it makes sense that it would affect mood. And, I think then again, that speaks to the consistency of just having a diet for the most part that is consistent to keep you kind of level, whatever your general kind of like disposition is. But I would agree in that, doing my own, I haven't done quite the experimental, the radical experiments that you have done necessarily, but, just being aware of like, oh, I had this for dinner or this for lunch or whatever, and this is how I felt. Just being like aware of your body. You don't even have to track anything. It's just like being aware of how you feel, I think can provide really, really interesting insights. And, a lot of people, whether they've gone on low carb or not, have noticed that as well. It's like when I eat this, my mood is worse. I, for one, think part of that could be due to sort of a guilt type of thing. I think a lot of people, if you eat a dessert, not only may that negatively impact your mood, like on a physiological level, but you're also feeling like shit about yourself. And so you're just gonna, thinking that has a bad impact on your physiology, not kind of like the placebo effect, so there's a little bit of that going on there. But no, I think,
but this is where experiments that are of a fixed amount of time also provide something else, because you're not going to have that, like the added sugar experiment. I enjoyed having those bottle caps, but I also knew it was for a fixed amount of time. So so I've kind of subtracted some amount of my guilt of enjoying it, because I knew it was only for this trial period and not to consider having it for later. I was going to continue being keto. So for that very reason, you can, when you have a span of time in mind from when you start to when you're going to end, that unlocks a lot of potential to think a bit more scientifically about yourself.
Yeah, that almost kind of supports the idea of of like a cheat day type of thing, because it allows you to like just eat, your French bun or your French dip, whatever, without any guilt, because it's like, oh yes, I'm back on track tomorrow, and I know I'll be back on track tomorrow, versus like these occasional mishaps where like you ate the piece of pie at Christmas that you didn't really want to eat, then you feel bad about yourself because you're like, oh well, what if I continue this habit? It's kind of, you're just taking more control over that. So I think, there could be a place for those kind of strategically implementing those type of things in a diet. But, we're all running our own experiments, and, I think it's a lot of fun to do that, just to become more aware of yourself. And it's awesome to see on social media, just all the people who, decades ago weren't necessarily interested in their health, and now they're just noticing how health or how nutrition has like an impact on their health. So it's very fun to see. All right, Dave. So where can listeners find more about you if they want to say hey, whether on social media, or find more about the studies? I'm going to include links to kind of, where they can find information on the lean mass hyperresponder study, your website, cholesterol code. I know I'll have links to all of those, but if they want to give you a follow on social media and say, hey, where can they do so?
Yeah. So my Twitter handle is real Dave Feldman. And yeah, I'm not as active in it as I used to be, but if this pertains to you and you want to connect with other people, we also have the Facebook groups, the Lean Mass Hyperresponder Facebook group and a cholesterol code Facebook group. You can just search for those, words, Facebook will connect you to it. But yes, cholesterolcode.com is sort of our hub site, although more of my time is now spent on the research end. So a lot of it ends up in a Citizen Science Foundation, which we have the .org. If any of your listeners are themselves, having gone low carb, see their LDL go up, their HDL go up, their triglycerides go down, I would encourage them to check out citizensciencefoundation.org and see if they qualify for the study, because of course they get free CT angiogram and wide spectrum blood work and genetic testing. We have a whole suite of things. And then outside of that, we have, yes, Own Your Labs is our blood reseller service, but we kind of secretly are trying to talk people into submitting their anonymized data for our data archive, because I'm very pro open science and open data, and we just don't have a lot of data on low carbers that isn't somehow already in some repository that few people have access to. And we're soon, hopefully, going to have our data repository up where we incentivize people at Own Your Labs, if they're getting their private blood work, to check this box. They get 10% off for submitting their anonymized data. And then that way other people, both formal and citizen researchers alike, can run analyses against these data sets that are anonymized. So
yeah, awesome. And yeah, I encourage everybody to check out all of kind of these things you just referenced. Get involved, a good way to learn about yourself, maybe get incentivized to provide your data, and who knows, maybe take part in a cool study that's going on if you fit that inclusion criteria. So once again, Dave, thanks so much for chatting with me today. I had a wonderful time, and hope you have a great rest of your day.
yeah, and thank you for having me.
Yeah, no problem. Bye.